Boa tarde, pessoal. Obrigada pela presença. Nós estamos reiniciando agora no segundo semestre as conferências da Escola de Educação Física e Esporte. E a gente tem a honra hoje de receber uma convidada internacional, né? 2 eventos internacionais, né? Terminando esse, inicia-se um outro, né? À tarde de Fisiologia do Exercício, liderado pela professora Cláudia também, quem quiser assistir, está convidado. Então é um prazer muito grande ter a professora Audrey Meer, da Universidade Tecnológica de Ciência da Universidade Norueguesa de Ciência e Tecnologia, tá? Que vai nos presentear hoje com uma palestra. Ela tem uma colaboração aqui com os nossos colegas da unidade, professor Dantas, professor Edson. Eles vão apresentar a palestrante, né? E agradeço então a presença de todos e dizer que depois, se tiver anuência da nossa palestrante, a palestra vai estar na nossa página do Facebook das conferências, ok? Só precisa tomar cuidado para não cair aqui, se ela ficar aqui na frente, tá bom? Então, Edson, quem que vai apresentar você ou Dantas?
Bom dia para todos. É um prazer apresentar a professora Audrey. Eu conheço a professora de nome porque nós fizemos doutorado na mesma época, na Inglaterra, e eu ouvi falar dela em Edimburgo. E nós nunca tivemos a chance de se encontrar. A professora é formada pela Universidade Ela estudou na Faculdade de Ciências do Movimento Humano da Universidade Livre de Amsterdã, na Holanda, e ela obteve o seu PhD em Psicologia Experimental na Universidade de Edimburgo, na Escócia, Reino Unido. O tema é muito interessante porque a professora faz parte de uma abordagem que mostra como o movimento faz parte da nossa vida. E os estudos que ela tem conduzido mostram como estudar, como investigar o movimento no contexto associado com ações. Eu não vou me estender muito sobre isso, vou deixar então a professora à vontade para falar. Obrigado.
Thank you very much. Do we think I need the microphone, or shall I just... Can I try without the microphone? No? You want the microphone?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Because we are recording.
Of course, yes. It's a bit unusual to stand like this, like a professional singer. Thank you very much, everybody from the university, for the invitation to come here to São Paulo and give a presentation about my work. I have been, ever since I can remember, very intrigued by child development, because I think it's so fascinating to see how a newborn baby who can't even hold up its own head, in the course of only 1 year, will learn so many new things. It will be able to walk up and down the stairs, it will be able to start talking, and it will be able to, and it will have developed a complete personality of its own. So you will never learn as much in your life as during the first year of life. And the first 1,000 days of a baby's life are very important because there's so much happening in brain development, perceptual development, and motor development. And the theme of my talk today is that motor development and perceptual development and brain development don't occur in a vacuum, but that these occur hand in hand. and that if we want to understand development, if we want to understand the underlying forces that drive development, we need to study perception, action, and the brain in conjunction, not separately, but together, because that is how they develop. And if we understand normal development in normal children better, then we also might be able to understand and to help children who don't follow the normal developmental pattern. For instance, babies that are born too early, prematurely, and then we can help them to catch up in their development. This picture is my youngest daughter, who is wearing the EEG equipment that we use in our lab. I work in the developmental neuroscience laboratory together with Ruud van der Weel, my husband, who is sitting over there. And this girl is with us in Brazil, and she's at the moment playing football with a ladies' team in São Paulo. What are they called again?
In Audax, Osasco.
Did you hear? Apparently they're quite good. Okay. In my research, and in the lab, we are very much inspired by two points of view. And one point of view is that brains have not evolved for thinking or feeling but our brains actually have evolved to control movements. So motor control, to make coordinated movements, is the primary reason why brains exist at all. And you can read more about this, or see more about this in this TED Talk by Daniel Wolpert. Another person who has been very important in our theoretical thinking has been James Gibson, the American psychologist, who has, since the 1960s, he's been stressing the reciprocity between perception and action. So he used to say that we must perceive in order to move, obviously use our eyes and our ears and our sense of smell in order to move. That is, everybody will agree with that. But we shouldn't forget that we must also move in order to perceive. So when we move through our environments, we create an optic flow, for instance, that will help us to control our next step, and will tell us whether we're moving forward or backwards and at what speed we're moving. And that is very important. So perception and action, and I would like to add the development of the brain, they all coexist and they should be studied together in order to get to the full picture. It doesn't help to study vision by putting your subjects in a biting machine where they can only move their eyes, because the beauty about the visual and motor system is that the visual scene stays the same whether I'm making all sorts of movements. Things are not changing, but they are staying stable, and that is the beauty of our perceptual motor system. And also, in our lab, we study the importance of self-produced locomotion for perceptual and brain development. So we see that as soon as babies start crawling or walking, their perceptual and brain development also shows a surge. And that is wholly complementary to the research already done in the 60s by Helden Heim, who studied kittens in a carousel, and both kittens were exposed to exactly the same visual environment, the stripes on the walls, but the only difference was that one of the kittens was not moving itself, but was traveling around in a gondola, whereas the other kitten was moving, was walking itself. They were exposed to exactly the same visual information, but only the kitten that walked itself developed normal vision. So that shows how important it is for all animals, all locomotory animals, to be able to move itself. And also for our babies, we see that as soon as they start crawling, their perceptual and brain development also makes some kind of quantum leap almost. Things go very fast after the onset of self-produced locomotion. But let's go to the very first movements that our babies make. Because our babies are born with a number of strange reflexes, the infantile neonatal reflexes, and all our babies have them. And the question is, you know, what is the function of these reflexes? Why are our babies born with these rudimentary motor patterns? So we can look at a few of the most well-known neonatal reflexes. We have the asymmetric tonic neck posture, which traditionally was thought to bring the arm the baby's head is turned to in the visual field of view, so that they can start learning about their own arms and start setting up eye-hand coordination. But actually, this reflex, as you can already see, the arm is still quite low and the baby is not looking at it. And it's actually quite difficult to elicit this response spontaneously. So when the baby is lying in its crib, the asymmetric tonic neck posture is hardly ever elicited. And if it is elicited, then it's usually a sign of brain damage. So we don't no longer think that this response is that its function has anything to do with setting up eye-hand coordination. There's the Babinski reflex, that if you stroke a baby under its foot sole, then the toes are supposed to expand. If you do the same thing with an adult, the toes are not supposed to expand, but the toes are supposed to contract. And if you get a patient from a road accident in the ER and you try to elicit this response and the toes expand, then that is a sign of brain damage. So it's funny that in our newborn babies it's one response, and in adults it's another response. What is the relationship between it? And we know very little about this. Then there's the stepping reflex. So if you hold a newborn baby under its arms and allow its feet to touch a tabletop or a solid surface, then the baby will start making stepping movements that are they look very controlled and coordinated. There's extension in the hip and the knee and the ankle, and it looks like the baby is walking. And for many, many years, researchers have speculated about the relationship between this very early reflex and later independent walking. So they thought they've tried to train babies on this reflex and see if they would start walking alone earlier. Theories have been developed around this phenomena, but nowadays we actually think that the function of the stepping reflex is not after birth, but it has a prenatal function. So when babies are lying in the womb, fetuses are lying in the womb, they have to make large positional changes, up to 20 large changes in the womb, to avoid growing, attaching themselves to the uterine wall, and to avoid bed sores. Like if old people stay lying in the same position in their bed for long periods of time, they will develop all these sores, which are very nasty and very difficult to heal. And fetuses are living in a warm, watery environment, and if they don't change position regularly, they will either attach to the uterine wall, or they will actually develop these bed sores, similar in old people. So we think that the stepping reflex has its function before birth. With placing the feet against the uterine wall, they will make a big somersault and make a big positional change that way. There's the palmar grasp reflex. If you put your finger into the hand palm of a newborn baby, it will grasp around it, and the reflex will be so strong that you can actually lift the baby up, and it will cling on to your fingers and won't drop. And that may have something to do with our very long evolutionary past, when we still had fur and lived in trees, and babies had to hang on to their mothers in order not to fall down large heights. And then there's this thing that babies have, which is called the swimming reflex, and not many people know this. So I'll show you a clip.
Newborn babies love to explore the exciting world in which they now find themselves. Providing the protective figure of the mother is close at hand, they'll happily swim in warm water. Sticking out their tongues to prevent swallowing and beating bravely with their stubby arms and legs while they stare intently at the strange sights they see before them. When this swimming ability was discovered back in the 1930s, it was explained away as nothing more than an automatic return to the womb. But it's more than that. The swimming baby actively suppresses its breathing. This didn't happen in the womb because the baby had not then started to use its lungs. Also, the swimming baby shows better coordination of movement in the water than it does on dry land at this age. And as this baby of only 10 days shows, the human infant can swim before it can crawl. This automatic swimming ability lasts for several months after birth. It then begins to decline, to be replaced later by learned swimming. Swimming isn't the only surprising ability of the newborn human.
Yes, so babies can swim. And all these reflexes, they have one thing in common. Namely, they exist at birth, and they will become weaker and eventually disappear during the first few months of life. If they stay, like for instance the asymmetric tonic neck response, then that's usually a bad sign and could be an early sign of brain damage. So the fact that they disappear is usually taken as evidence of the cortical maturation theory, a very influential theory in child development that says that our babies are born with immature brains that can't produce voluntary movements at will that are controlled by the baby itself. Because the idea is that when our babies are born, their brains are still in a primitive state, and the cortex has not developed yet, so all the movements or the reflexes that the baby produces are controlled by subcortical systems in the brain. And then during the first few months, the baby's brain will mature, and it will gradually start suppressing those primitive brain centers, and that will eventually open up the way for the baby to start producing self-initiated voluntary movements that the baby has control over. So initially, when you put your finger into a newborn baby's hand, it can only close its fingers around it and hang on for dear life. But then, and that is under subcortical control. But then as the baby's brain matures, the reflex will weaken, and the baby will be able to start making voluntary reaching movements and start being able to touch and grasp objects around it. That's the idea. So in a sense, what we are saying, or what the cortical maturation theory is saying, is that our babies are born with these primitive brains, and that they have to spend the first 4 months of their lives waiting for their brains to mature, so that they finally can start life properly. Yeah, it's a bit like a good bottle of wine or a nice cheese. It has to mature until we can enjoy it. And that has always sounded a bit strange to me, because I have 5 children myself, and I've been, like I said, I've been interested in child development for a long time, and it doesn't, if you look closely at newborn babies, okay, they don't have really nice control and coordination, but I don't think it's because of their immature brains why their movements are not so sophisticated. I think there's other things going on. And the last 30 to 40 years, more and more people working in child development and infant development, they have done beautiful experiments showing that even the fetus is not as primitive as the cortical maturation theory would have it. So I'm going to show you a few examples. With ultrasound, we can now observe the fetus inside the womb over long periods of time without damaging the baby or the fetus. And the fetus has been shown to produce individual, intricate finger movements. We have seen fetuses sucking their thumb inside the womb. It will take the average neonate about 4 to 6 weeks before it finally finds its thumb again and can move its thumb voluntarily to the mouth. Also, research from Peter Happer in Belfast has shown that the fetus recognizes sounds it was exposed to inside the womb. So he studied mothers who were hooked on the soap series Neighbours, the Australian soap series. I don't know if you know it, with Kylie Minogue and Jason Donovan. That was very popular both in Australia and in the UK. And these mothers, they used to watch Neighbours every day during the last trimester of their pregnancy. And then when the babies were born, they were played the theme song of Neighbours over headphones, and by carefully monitoring their heart rate and their sucking rate, they could show experimentally that the babies recognized the song, and the only way they could have recognized it was because they had heard it before when they were still inside the womb. So this all doesn't sound like primitive creatures to me. This actually sounds like quite sophisticated behavior and controlled behavior. And also, in recent years, researchers have found that neonates, newborn babies only a couple of hours old, can imitate both gestures, hand opening and closing, and sticking out your tongue. And if you start thinking about it, that is actually quite a complicated thing, because first of all, your vision has to be working so that you have a proper view of the person that you will be imitating. And then secondly, the newborn baby has to realize that its body is similar to the person he is trying to imitate. And then it has to contract the muscles that will make for the hand opening and closing and the tongue sticking out. So that is, again, quite sophisticated stuff we're talking about in babies that have literally just been born. So have a look at this.
Well, imitation, just 15 minutes after being born. When he makes a particular gesture or facial expression, the baby watches closely and then copies him. He makes a movement with his hand. The baby's hand performs the same action. Now he tries a completely different kind of action, slowly sticking out his tongue. The baby fixates him with its eyes, registers what he's doing, and after a pause for its newly active brain to take it all in, then does the same. Until this was filmed, many experts refused to believe that such responsiveness was possible in the newborn, but it's here for all to see. Every baby stays wide awake during this first hour after birth, before dropping off into a deep slumber. And it's during this time that it normally makes visual contact with its mother, a crucial moment in the formation of the parent-offspring bond.
Yeah. So we are left with this discrepancy. So on the one hand, we have the followers of the cortical maturation theory who say that our babies are primitive creatures, incapable of producing movements at will. And on the other hand, we have all this beautiful research, psychological research, showing that babies are so much more capable, even fetuses and very newborn babies are so much more capable than we ever could think of. And that led me to believe that maybe there's something wrong with the cortical maturation theory. Maybe there's other factors that make that our babies look a little bit clumsy once they're born. I mean, they can't even hold up their own heads, and their movements are a bit erratic. But maybe that's not because of their immature brains, but because of other factors that are typical for the human baby. And one problem that our newborns are faced with is that they have a relatively big head. So here's the newborn, and the head is about a quarter of its total body size. Compared to the adult, the head is only 1/8 of the total body size. So if you compare this big head size to our situation, then it would mean going around your daily business with a large watermelon on your shoulders. That, would make anybody look clumsy. And of course, our newborns, they've been spending the past 9 months in a watery environment where the effect of gravity is not as big. So they haven't had opportunity to build muscles that can deal with gravity. So that's why their heads are so floppy and will fall. And that's why everybody tells you when you pick up a newborn baby, be careful with the head. Support the head, be careful. But of course, our brains are so large compared to monkey brains babies. Monkeys have very small heads compared to our babies. Another thing is, because we don't have any fur to keep us warm, our babies are born chubby, fat, to say it impolitely, because we use subcutaneous fat to keep us warm, because we don't have any hair to keep us warm. So a huge head, the size of a watermelon, a huge heavy head, and a fat body, that would make anybody look clumsy, right? So I don't think it has anything to do with our brains being so immature at birth. It has more to do with other physiological things that happen to affect us more than other primates or other mammals. So to make my point, I would like to have a closer look at the ultimate reflex, the sucking reflex. All our babies are born with a very strong reflex, a sucking reflex, which of course the function is evident. That will help the baby to drink milk from the breast or a bottle from the very first minute. But taking food as a newborn baby, is that really only about sucking, or is it all about a precise coordination between sucking, breathing, and swallowing, which would make it much more complicated? It's not. I don't think feeding is just about sucking. It's about getting the sucking, breathing, and swallowing pattern coordinated so that milk will flow from the breast into the right tube. Yeah? And we know that the fetus has been sucking and swallowing from the 4th month in pregnancy. Fetuses drink amniotic fluid and they pee it out again. And it's refreshed regularly. But breathing, of course, that is, they haven't had a chance to practice the breathing on top of the sucking and the swallowing, because that changes as soon after birth. So what we did was we wanted to take a closer look at this coordination pattern of sucking, breathing, and swallowing. So what we did was we attached a pressure transducer to a nipple, to a bottle nipple. And so every time the baby, and we took the equipment to the hospital, to the neonatal department. So the babies we tested were between 2 and 3 days of age. And so every time the baby sucked milk from the bottle, we got a signal, a sinus signal. We also attached a breathing band around the baby's breast. So every time they expanded their breast to breathe in air, we got another signal. And in addition, we had a stethoscope that was directly linked to a computer. So every time the baby swallowed, we recorded the sound with the stethoscope and got another signal. So here in black we have the sucking. So every trough here is a suck. And then in red you have the breathing pattern, expansion and up and down. And the blue triangles are the swallows. And by careful analysis we found that a well-coordinated feeding pattern is characterized by a one-to-one-to-one coordination of sucking, swallowing, and breathing. Okay? We also observed that some babies didn't cope well. And the problem always was coordinating the breathing onto the sucking and the swallowing. So breathing was the bottleneck. That was the problem. So here you see a baby who is sucking in black and is swallowing the triangles, but the breathing pattern goes very flat. So this baby is sucking and swallowing, but it's not drawing in any breaths. So it will eventually, this is 15 seconds, it will eventually turn a little bit blue in the face and will have to take a pause in the sucking and swallowing and catch its breath and then start sucking and swallowing again. So it's obvious that this is not a very economical way of feeding, because, you know, the baby is losing a lot of energy getting milk into it and without breathing, and it may actually fall asleep before it's completely satisfied and then wake up early, and then you quickly come in this negative spiral of feeding problems, where the baby is crying a lot and struggling, and the mother is getting desperate, and so on and so forth. We did a lot of more very sophisticated analysis, and we found that maximum sucking pressure, so those froths, they are ideally coordinated with breathing out. And we found that swallowing takes place just before the onset of the next suck and between breathing in and breathing out. So here I've blown up a 20-second feeding pattern, and we see that here in the beginning, swallowing, maximum sucking pressure is coordinated with breathing out, like here. And then over the next 3 sucks, something is happening. Things are shifting slightly. And we see that here, maximum sucking pressure is coordinated with breathing in. And here as well. And that is not desirable. That is not an optimal way of drinking milk from a bottle. So what does this baby do? Only 2 days old. It could just continue on this collision course where things will go wrong, and it might risk actually getting milk into the airway and milk coming out of its ears. But no, this baby is not doing that. What this baby does is introducing a short pause where it stops, a self-initiated pause in the sucking, and then it starts sucking again, and again, and again, and already by the 3rd suck, after the self-initiated pause, maximum sucking pressure is again coordinated with breathing out, and it continues for the next few minutes, like this. So when I see this kind of control and coordination in a very newborn baby, I get very excited. And I have a hard time believing that there's anything wrong with the central nervous system of this baby. This looks very healthy to me. Of course, if I see a baby that keeps on using the same coordination despite it not being optimal, but without being able to do anything about it, then I get worried that this baby may have some form of brain damage. Another thing we looked at was early arm movements in newborn babies. Traditionally, all the movements that newborn babies make are explained away as involuntary, excited threshing of the arms and legs, not under cortical control, but under primitive control of the primitive parts of the brain. And for my PhD, I was trying to show that although early arm movements still look a bit clumsy, the babies have some control over them. So what we did was we placed newborn baby on its back, and the neck muscles of newborn babies are still so weak that the head will fall to one side, either the right or the left. Actually, the head will fall more often to the right hand side, which makes that the babies see more of their right hands, and which could explain why most of us are right-handed. But that's another story. And what we did was we placed small weights, curtain weights, at the end, and attached strings to the baby's wrists, and these strings passed over pulleys, and the weights were attached so that the arms were effectively pulled away from the baby's face. And we wanted to see whether the babies were able or would be willing to fight the weights in order to keep their arms inside, in front of their eyes and inside their field of view. So we had 3 different conditions. This was one condition where the baby saw the hand on the side of the body the face was turned to, the ipsilateral side, and it wouldn't be able to see the contralateral hand. We had a condition where we put occluders around the baby's face so that it could see either hand, couldn't see either hand. And we had a third condition where we filmed the baby's contralateral hand and showed it to the baby on a monitor on the ipsilateral side. And in these 3 different experiments or conditions, we expected that the babies would only hold up the arm they could see, either directly, as here, or indirectly on the monitor on the ipsilateral side, but it was the contralateral arm that was filmed. And we found that that was indeed the case. Babies are willing to fight forces that pull their arms away from their face, but only if they can see that arm. So that shows that from birth, babies have a visual interest in their arms and are enjoying control and looking at their self-produced arm movements. And of course they learn an awful lot about themselves. They learn that their arms are not like any other object in the environment, but that they belong to themselves and that they can use their arms to eventually start touching and grasping objects in the environment. So rather than arm movements being involuntary and reflexive movements during 4 months, and then as cortical maturation occurs, the reflexes are suppressed and opening up the way for voluntary reaching and grasping, what we think is that the movements are voluntary and under some control right from the start, and that the babies use the first 3 to 4 months to learn about themselves and to learn about the consequences of their actions in the environment, so that after 4 months of training almost and learning, they can then start reaching out and grasp objects. So here, this is my oldest daughter when she was 3 months old, and she is not, she hasn't started reaching yet. And her parents, both being psychologists and interested in eye-hand coordination, we stimulated her by putting all sorts of toys in her cot to look at and play with. And we decided to film her while she was alone in her cot to see what she was doing in terms of eye-hand coordination. In terms of speech production, researchers, they record babbling sounds and talking in babies while they're alone in their cots a lot. But in terms of motor development, nobody had ever done this. This is in 1990. No, 91, I suppose, yeah. And so let's have a look at what Zoe, her name is Zoe, what she's doing. So remember that this is not, she's not reaching yet, but she has a very strong interest in her visual arms. So she's moving them up and down. And whenever she accidentally touches one of the toys above her head, she seems really surprised, like, was that me? And actually what we did, this was at the department, and I had fed her and cleaned her, and she was ready to go to bed again, so I put her down and filmed her. And she slept for maybe half an hour, and then she woke up and started doing this for half an hour. And then she fell asleep again and slept for 2 more hours. So if I hadn't been filming her, I would never have known that she actually practiced looking at her arms and hands for half an hour. You know, this was the first and only time I ever filmed her. So, and you never know, but Zoe became a very good handball player. Who actually competed for Team GB, because she was born in Edinburgh, in the London Olympics. And she played Brazil, and I'll just show a very short clip where she scores from the wing. She's left-handed, so she's playing on the right-hand side over there, and she lobs in a goal against Brazil. There, did you see it? They lost the game, but never mind. She scored against Brazil. And Brazil has been making very good advancements since 2012 in handball. Okay. 2 central concepts in our research. One is the concept of affordances, introduced by James Gibson in 1979, and he claims that an affordance refers to the fit between an animal's capabilities and the environmental supports and opportunities, both good and bad, that make possible a given activity. So, by looking at her own hands, she starts learning about what is within reach and what is outside of reach. She learns about what is graspable in terms of her own hand size, or what is too big to be grasped. And that requires some time, and we think it requires maybe 3 to 4 months of daily looking at your hands and finding out about relationships between yourself and the environment. So objects or events are not perceived per se, but are perceived in relation to the person who is, to the organism who is doing the looking or making the actions. It's very important. So water, for example, is drinkable. It affords swimming to those of us who can swim, but it also affords drowning to those of us who can't swim. Yeah, so it's very dependent on the animal or the organism who's doing the looking, what a given property of the environment affords for action. And for some animals, like this water bug, water actually affords walking. And to God, water also affords walking. Okay, so that's one thing. Affordances is very important. I'll just hop over this one. Another important concept is the concept of prospective control. All movements have to be controlled by perceiving what is going to happen in the near future. So if I walk like this, I can actually see that if I don't do anything, if I don't slow down or if I don't change my direction of walking, I will crash into this thing. Yeah? So effective actions are all about perceiving what is going to happen in the near future, so that you can take evasive action or slow or stop. But not all actions are about avoiding collisions. Sometimes you have to you want to collide with the environment. If in case of catching a ball or hitting a ball, you want to make the collision, but in a controlled way, so that you don't injure your body. So here we have this person here, this football player. Obviously he wanted to head the ball, but he hasn't timed it very well, so it's colliding in the middle of his face, which is actually quite painful. But also when we're walking or running, there's a lot of prospective control going on to dampen your footfalls so that you don't injure your back or your spine. And also in a more social setting, when you want to kiss a loved one, you want to make contact with your loved one's lips, but you don't want your kiss to end up in mid-air, and you don't want to give him or her a bloody nose either. You want the lips to make contact, but in a controlled and precise, soft way, to avoid injury. So, for instance, when babies start catching or reaching for moving toys, there you see the need for prospective control a lot, because if you want to intercept or catch a moving toy, it makes no sense to move your arm to the place where you last saw the toy, but you have to move your arm to a place, a virtual meeting place, where the toy and your hand will meet in order to catch it. And that requires prospective control of head movements, eye movements, and arm movements. So here we have a baby who is catching moving toys. She was filmed from the front and from above. So the toy is moving. Very good. Good work. Good work. Good work. This baby is about 11 months, so she's really good at it now. And we change the speed of the toy. Okay. Ready? Oh. Super fishy. So we'll watch this last catch in slow motion, and I want you to pay particular attention to when she shifts her gaze to the catching place and when she starts moving her hand. Now she shifts her gaze and now she shifts her hand, and the toy is still on the other side of the occluder, but she has to anticipate the toy, because if she waits until the toy appears in the catching area, then she will miss it because she will be too late. So we've done lots of catching studies with babies, also with full-term babies and preterm babies, and we find that some of the preterm babies, they don't use a very sophisticated timing strategy, which could be an early indication of brain damage. And then in Trondheim, in Norway, in 2004, we got this EEG system. So now for the first time, we could see what was going on inside the head while babies were developing both their motor and perceptual skills. So what we do is we put a baby with this hair net consisting of 128 electrodes in a baby chair in front of a large screen, and we present visual motion on the screen. So we simulate forward and backward motions, we simulate an object on a collision course or that veers off to the side, and we have a little car that moves around and is occluded, just like in the catching studies, for a brief period of time, so that the baby will need to time its actions to the speed of the toy, and it also needs to have object permanence and to realize that when something moves behind something else, it's not gone forever, but it will appear on the other side, and it needs to time its actions according to that. So we study, in general, 3 visual motion paradigms. Occlusion, like in the catching studies, where we simulate the disappearance and subsequent reappearance of a moving object. We simulate, or we have optic flow experiments, simulating forward and backward motions motion at different speeds, and looming. And I'll show a little bit more about optic flow and looming. So this is our optic flow experiment. This is what it looks like to the baby. On a large screen in front of the baby, we produce these dots. This is random motion. This is random motion as well. This is simulating forward motion and backward motion. So the baby sits and watches this for maybe 5 minutes if we're lucky. And then we collect a lot of trials, and we do brain analyses to see what is going on inside the baby's head. And we test most of our babies once at 3 months before they have any self-produced locomotor experience, and then again around their first birthday, when they have been crawling around or walking around for at least 6 weeks. And then if you do EEG research, once you present a visual stimulus, you will get a response in the brain, which is called the N200 negativity peak, which only can be elicited after visual motion, something moving in the visual field. And what we see is that for forward optic flow, the response occurs faster, sooner after stimulus onset, than for random visual motion in the POZ area, which is in the occipital and parietal areas of the brain. And then if we compare adults to infants, we see that adults show the response much faster than infants do. So the baby's brains are not myelinated as much as the adult brain is. So it takes babies longer to respond. But you see clearly that for both adults and infants, they respond much faster when it's structured optic flow as opposed to random visual motion. So the babies and adults are actually helped by the structure in the optic flow simulating forward or backward motion than when we just present the dots randomly. Then they struggle more to make sense of the visual information. So we have seen, and other studies have shown the same, that sensitivity to optic flow is significantly increased when infants start crawling, suggesting that the functional detection of optic flow develops hand in hand with self-produced locomotion. We also done this longitudinally, and here we see that before babies have started crawling at 3 to 4 months, they show equally long responses for forwards, reverse, and random visual motion. But as soon as the same babies have had about 6 weeks of crawling experience, and when we test them again at 11 to 12 months, they clearly differentiate between the 3 different conditions and show the shortest latencies for forward optic flow, which is the type of optic flow they have most experience with, because that is what you get when you move forwards. And then slightly longer latencies for backward or reversed optic flow, which is what you get when you walk backwards. And you know, that is, even for us, not the most common visual condition. And long latencies for random visual motion. We also have looked at preterm babies, babies who are born at least 8 weeks early. And what we see is, the main result here is that the full-term babies at 1 year, they differentiate as before between the 3 different conditions of visual motion. But the preterm babies, they show equally long latencies for all 3 conditions. So that makes us to believe that the preterm babies at age 1, even although they've had the same amount of motor experience with crawling, they somehow don't manage to see the difference between forward, backwards, and random motion, which we believe is because they were born at a very critical time when their dorsal visual processing stream was developing very fast. And at that time they were born because they were born too early. And that has somehow disrupted the development. These babies, they have now all started school, and they are 6 years of age, and we have tested them again on the same tasks, and we're now in the middle of analyzing these results for the preterm children. Another paradigm is that of looming. So when an object approaches you on a collision course, it will grow very fast, and we can have a look at what it looks like for the baby. So the baby is sitting, watching this ball coming towards it. The blue dot here is its gaze, so it's really glued to the screen and watching the approaching ball all the time. Sometimes it's coming on a collision course and the baby will blink. Sometimes it's veering off, and then the baby realizes very soon that this is not a threatening situation. Okay. And this is what it looks like in the brain when the baby is watching a fast loom appearing. So you see in the visual cortex, the whole area is lighting up with activity, with electrical activity in response to the looming stimulus. There you have the looming related response. So when we analyze these data, we can identify on a trial-by-trial data this looming-related brain response. And that response has a start and an end and a duration. And we see that with age, the duration becomes shorter. So babies process this kind of information faster. We can also see how well the response was timed in relation to the end of the stimulus where the collision takes place, the visual collision. And we see that 12-month-olds, full terms, they time their brain response at a fixed time to collision. So at about a half a second before the loom will hit their faces, they show this response, irrespective of whether the loom is coming towards them slowly or very fast. The preterm babies and the all younger babies, they do something different for the 3 different loom speeds, which is not a very good solution to the problem. Keeping the time to contact fixed allows the baby the same time to respond to the loom by, for example, blinking or putting up his hands or ducking away, irrespective of the loom speed, of the speed of the loom. And here we see in a longitudinal design what's happening. We'll see that the response in the young baby starts early and is occipitally, whereas in the older baby the response starts closer to contact and moves up the dorsal stream to the parietal areas of the brain, which are specialized in detecting speed, direction, time to contact, and planning further action. When we collect electrical activity with the system that we use, we use these surface electrodes that pick up electrical activity from the skull surface. But really, what we're interested in, hello? So maybe yeah. But really, what we're interested in is finding out where in the brain the activity originated. So that's when we use source analysis, it's called, where we use inverse mathematics to count back from the surface activity to where in the brain the activity originated. And then you get source waveforms like this. And you see that for the youngest babies, here they're 5 to 7 months, the source waveforms are very long in duration, which means that their brains are not myelinated much yet, so it takes them longer to process this kind of information. But for the older babies, 10 to 11 months, they are very short. But these source waveforms, the babies don't seem to be able to differentiate between the 3 different loom speeds that we use. So we do another analysis, and there we kind of unwrap the source waveforms. And by doing this analysis here, you see that the young babies, they show the same response for the 3 loom speeds. And then the slightly older babies, 8, 9 months, they start differentiating between the 3 speeds visually. And then the oldest babies with the most motor experience, they clearly differentiate between fast looms, medium looms, and slow looms. So that is very interesting to see, and we hope that the preterm babies show the same kind of development. So in the course of development, during the first year of life, the temporal structure of looming information is increasingly well differentiated in the neural circuitry of the infant brain, providing infants with increasingly veridical time-to-collision information about looming danger as they grow older and become more mobile. How much time do I have?
10 minutes.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit around the importance of brain development. Because I already mentioned that the first 1,000 days of a baby's life are probably the most important. And a lot is happening during those first 1,000 days. And neurons in the infant brain, they increase in number and become more specialized and more interconnected. So there's more couplings between nerve cells, and the networks, they increase. And we estimate that there are between 700 and 1,000 new couplings between nerve cells or brain cells per second during the first 3 years of a child's life. So that's, you know, you almost can't imagine how much is happening in the brain during this early period of life. And we also know that existing networks that are not being used, they will disappear in favor of networks that are being used. Okay? So if you have a network in the brain, then you should keep using it. Otherwise it will disappear. It's just like a path in the forest that is not being used. It will be overgrown by plants before you know it, especially in the rainforest, and it will disappear. So at birth, all babies in all countries speaking all languages of the world, they will recognize all the different sounds produced in all languages. But by the age of 8 months, babies will have lost recognizing or differentiating the sounds that are not being used in their native language. So if you want your baby to be able to speak English or other languages as well as their mother tongue, you should expose the baby to English-speaking people, because you can't learn it by the television or the radio. You actually have to interact with real people speaking the language for the baby to be able to recognize the different sounds in that particular language. So Chinese babies, they can, when they're young, hear the difference between R and L. R sound and the L sound. But when they're 8 months old, they no longer hear the difference. So when you go to Vietnam or China and you order some rice, and your servitor, the person serving you, comes back to you and says, "Here is your rice." It's not because they can't produce the R sound, but it's simply because they don't hear the difference between lice and rice. Because it's not important in Chinese or Vietnamese to be able to hear the difference between these sounds. So, yeah. I think in Portuguese and in Spanish, the difference between the V and the B is almost non-existent. Is that right? Is that in Portuguese as well? Like Havana and Habana, it almost sounds the same. No? Different sounds? Okay. Okay, but anyway, in Chinese, it's true. And the thing is, you know, the brain uses this principle of use it or lose it. If you're not using it, the brain will disappear from your capabilities. So if it's, you know, it's important to expose babies to, if you want them to be able to speak these languages as well as they speak their mother tongue, to languages early. Because if you wait until the child is like 7 or 8, then it will be much more difficult. Toddlers, they need a stimulating environment. Also, very young babies who've just learned to crawl and to walk. We know from rat research that young rats who were allowed to grow up in a kind of gym, in a cage which had tunnels and climbing possibilities and also exercise wheels and so on, their brains were much better developed than rats who grew up in ordinary cages without any facilities for moving and exploration. And that, you know, we can't do this kind of experiments with babies because we can't cut them up and look at the dendrites in the brain and see how much more developed, stimulated babies' brains are as opposed to understimulated babies' brains. But if we can extrapolate the results from brain research, then we might come to the same conclusion. Also in Britain, you still have this fairly strong upper class, lower class division, where upper class children are not allowed to climb in the curtains and jump on the sofa and so on, whereas lower class children are left much more free. And when compared, this research was done in the 1970s, it was shown that the lower class children who had much more active exploration activity, they had much better motor control than the upper class children. So there's this thing about brain plasticity. The growing brain is open and malleable. It is capable to change and adjust to the circumstances that surround it. And the brain of young children between the ages of 0 to 3 shows largest plasticity. So, I mean, we now know that the brain remains plastic throughout life. But even so, the young brain is more plastic than the older brain. So it's important to stimulate young babies. They almost require stimulation, and it's not the case that young babies, because their movements look so clumsy and are so primitive, that they don't need extra stimulation. They probably need the most stimulation because of the fact that the brain is still so plastic at this early age. And of course, and it's not difficult to teach a 2-year-old to swim or a 2-year-old to read, but we as adults have to provide the letters and the watery environment, because otherwise we will never know. So it's our duty to expose our babies and young children to as many different situations as possible, so that the babies can explore and learn. And then some babies might enjoy swimming, whereas other babies might enjoy reading. But if they're not given the opportunity, it's our task to give them varied as possible experience, so that they can develop their brains. And this is something that I picked up from an Australian website, which I can relate to very much. That childhood is not a race to see how quickly a child can read, write and count. But childhood is a small window of time to learn and develop at the pace which is right for each individual child. So that is, as teachers or psychologists or people with pedagogy background, we should look at the child we're trying to teach or help, or as parents, and offer a varied and rich and stimulating environment for the child to pick. But if we don't offer anything, then there's nothing to pick for the child. But it's not about pushing the child and forcing things on the child, but to at least offer an environment that is as varied and rich as possible. So then, finally, some concluding remarks. Instead of underestimating infants and young children, we should rather treat them as competent individuals with a large potential for learning. And therefore, it is important to realize that old maturational theories still dictate our views on how we should raise our young ones. From a maturational theory, we would say, don't push the child. Wait to teach the child things until it's ready for it. And what we're really saying is until its brain is mature enough to deal with these kind of experiences. Don't try to teach your child to use the potty too early, because you might screw up its head forever. In other cultures, there's no big deal. 1-year-olds can use the potty both day and night. They're dry both day and night by their first birthday, and it's expected of them, and they're taught this kind of thing. The same with spoon use and other things. Even small babies need to be given the opportunity to be able to unfold themselves perceptually, cognitively and physically through varied experiences, so that their natural inquisitiveness is given a boost to explore themselves and their action capabilities in the world around them. Again, this is our duty to teach our children and to expose them to as varied experiences as possible. And potential problems will probably manifest themselves in the rapid development during the child's first 2 years of life. And it's important to deal with these problems immediately through tailor-made challenges and extra stimulation, rather than assuming that the child will grow out of it. Yeah, that's another thing that, at least in Europe, it's a very big deal. We don't want to upset parents by giving an early diagnosis, but we rather say that all children develop at their own pace and in their own time, and hopefully we think that, or we tell parents that their child will eventually catch up with the other children and grow out of it, but then you waste early intervention possibilities where the brain is still at its maximum plasticity, where you actually can make a difference, rather than so you should go in there early, rather too early than too late, basically. And then in relation to this, with varied experiences, we see across the world very young babies and toddlers spending time on telephones and iPads, and of course potentially a baby or a young child, there are nice apps available that can teach children a lot through the computer. But the problem is that this kind of technology makes the child passive. It sits there, and rather than experiencing the real world in 3D with all its colors and smells and sounds, it is experiencing life on a flat screen, basically. And it's not moving at all. So my problem with these kind of devices is not so much about what the babies are doing while they're playing games on their iPad. It's more about the things that they are not doing and should be doing instead, namely walking about, crawling about their environments, learning about what is around the corner, learning about concepts such as roundness and behind and in front of things, under, over, all these different cognitive concepts that are so important for later cognitive development as well. So potentially iPads are not dangerous, but they take up time that the babies should be spending on interacting with real people in the real world with all its rich smells and sounds and sights and touch and so on and so forth. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to some of our babies who participated in our studies. Any questions? Yes?
Hi, my name is Sarah. I work here. I wonder if you have some results about the difference between preterms and full terms in older ages, because here in Brazil we have, I think it's a public health problem that we have high rates of C-sections, and babies are born most preterms, 38, 37 weeks, when they should be in the womb for weeks that I think that are crucial for this development. And I wonder if you have some results about this difference like you showed.
Yeah. First of all, I agree very much with you that 37 and 38 weeks is too early. But in terms of the World Health Organization, they don't count babies that are born after 37 weeks as preterm. Anything between 37 and 42 weeks is...
Naturally, or through, because here...
Yeah,
we...
Either way, yes.
Yeah.
So we have only tested babies who were born at least 8 weeks too early. So from 32 weeks and earlier.
All right.
Yeah. But I agree. I also think, and I've talked a lot with Priscilla about this, that it's a dangerous way to go to have these planned cesareans because they plan them slightly ahead of time. And the baby, of course, during the last 4 weeks of pregnancy is developing a lot, especially gaining a lot of weight that they need to be able to afford to lose some weight during those early weeks when they're still struggling with the breastfeeding. Yeah, so they need this extra weight to be able to lose it when they're still finding out about and learning about sucking, breathing and swallowing. But anyway, we have tested the children that were born prematurely, both on optic flow, on loom and on looming. And we see that we saw that when they were babies, that there were still huge problems. That the term babies, they showed this huge development during the course of the first year, whereas the preterm babies' development was completely flat. And so when we tested them again at 6 years, we were very nervous and interested to see what had happened in between 1 and 6 years. And we found basically that most of the problems that we observed at age 1 had disappeared, luckily enough. But the preterm babies still had some minor problems that we will follow them up again when they're like teenagers to see if all the problems have disappeared by that time or not. Yeah, but luckily enough, most problems had disappeared, but there were still some problems remaining that we need to further investigate.
E mais? Se quiser, fala em português, gente.
May I try a bit in English? I don't have the practice. In the experiment, when the baby was with the head look to or the hand or to a monitor,
Yeah.
I want to know what's the perspective of the monitor. Was filming by that side? Because what I understand in your speak is that the children was looking to that and pulling the weight. It's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
It was what happened.
Yeah.
So I really want to know what's the perspective. What the camera was here.
Filming that hand.
Yeah.
And projecting on the monitor on the other side of the baby.
So it's like was the view of an outsider.
Yes.
The view of his own head.
Yes.
As if you were
Yeah.
turning.
So it's because it's hard to believe. So it's hard to believe because it's a third-person perspective. The camera wasn't here, looking to the hand. The baby here.
Oh no! The camera. I put the camera filming the hand from this side. Yeah, that's right.
Third person.
Yes, in a way.
How is possible?
But I made sure that the range of movement was the same and the size of the hand was the same on the monitor.
Okay.
And in this respect, many people have asked me, did you look at learning at all? And but it took me maybe 2 minutes to set up the camera so that the range of arm movement on the monitor was similar to the range of arm movement in real life, and the size of the hand was similar. It took me maybe 2 minutes, and in those 2 minutes, these newborn babies, who were all less than 4 weeks old when tested, had already worked out that this time it didn't, there was no point in moving this arm, but they should be moving this arm in order to get a nice visual display on the monitor. 2 minutes, it took them 2 minutes to find out. Yeah.
Thank you.
Audrey, anybody else? I have 3 questions. One is a hypothesis.
Yes.
The other one is about the taxonomy. And the last one is a philosophical.
3 questions. You said only 2. Okay.
About breathing.
Yes.
I find breathing very important for movements and actions. And you mentioned breathing, and we know that breathing is happening in the fetus.
The breathing movements, yes.
Even though it's not exchanging,
No.
but it's breathing. I wonder, I have been wondering about breathing, and I think breathing works like a metronome, timing movements, because we use breathing a lot. Take a deep breath when you are facing some challenge. And I wonder whether we could try to design the weather, and I saw your coordination said about certain swallowing breathing. Whether breathing is the rate limiting factor that acts on coordination. The second question is, you said that all movements will involve prospective control. But this will also apply to reactive movements or reflexes or spontaneous movements. I've been trying to work a taxonomy because one problem that we have is about intention. What is intention? How can you measure intention? And this is an old problem. There is some old stuff from Darwin, Charles Darwin, and also another person, Prayer, who wrote about babies in the late 18th century and then 19th century, discussing about intention in babies. And this is always a problem, how to say that there's an intention to do something. But perspective control, you can measure. And I was thinking about a taxonomy with 3 movements. Movements, reflex movements, spontaneous movements, and then you have perspective. But in your talk, I was wondering whether we can say that in reflexes we also have perspective control or even in spontaneous movement. I don't know if it's clear. But and the last one is philosophical, because you said just in the beginning about the importance of movement, and you quote a person from a TED talk. But I remember that Roger Sperry in the 1950s wrote a paper saying that the brain evolved to make us behave better. That is he even wrote, the sole product of brain function is motor coordination.
I never knew that it was Sperry who said that, maybe as the first person.
I think it's very interesting because, and you finish showing babies typing or using a cell phone. And I would like to know what, because it seems that movement is at the heart of living.
Yes, I very much agree with that.
And we how to deal with that with a society, with all this technological advance that seems to separate movement from ourselves.
Yes. Yeah, so bodily movement is important. And we control bodily movement through perceiving and using our sense organs, our eyes and our ears and so on. So they help us to produce skilled actions, or even, I would go as far as saying, as to help us to behave more behave better, show better behavior. Yes, and now I forgot some breathing. Breathing, I think, is also very much at the fundamental for many of the skills we perform. Breathing is it's grounded in breathing. And there are studies with preterm babies again, where they put a teddy bear that breathes together with the baby in the cot, and they kind of, the teddy bear kind of sets the rhythm for the breathing, and the baby attunes with its breathing to the teddy bear, and it thrives much better. So the teddy bear breathing is helping the baby to control its breathing. And of course we know fetuses make breathing movements in the womb without actually drawing air, because they will get their air through the placenta. But that is probably so that the lung tissue can develop properly. It needs movement to develop properly, so that as soon as the baby is born and the blood flow is redirected with the heart, the valve in the heart closing, and it has to send oxygen through its body itself.
The lesson about perspective control in reflexes and spontaneity.
Yeah, I
Personally, I don't think there's much prospective control occurring in reflexive behavior. I mean, reflexes are very primitive, and they are outside our own control, outside our will. It's when you go to the doctor and he taps your kneecap, and you know he's coming with his little hammer, and even if you try not to make the movement, you will make the kicking movement anyway. It's outside our control. And I don't think our babies, our newborns' actions and behaviors are best described as reflexes. I agree that they look a little bit clumsy, but that is more because, like I said, they're born with this huge head and with this fat body and not being used to gravity, so they can't build up, they haven't had the opportunity to build up muscles, neck muscles for instance, or arm muscles that are strong enough to lift their arms and hold their heads against gravity, which is trying to pull it down. So prospective control, I don't think has much is much involved in reflexive movements, but in spontaneous movements and in intentional movements, yes, because all movements have to be controlled by perceiving what is going to happen in the near future, so that you can act upon it. You can blink your eyes just before the collision occurs, or you can change direction, or you can put on the brakes when driving a car, and the car in front of you stops. You see that if you continue at this speed in this trajectory, then you will hit the car in front of you.
Can I
Yeah.
have a go at this intentionality question? Not that I have the answers for that, but a couple of weeks ago we were in France, and there was a person talking about creativity. That from an ecological perspective, creativity from a designer or an artist was not something that was in the head and taken as a starting point for designing new objects, but they were taking creativity as a process that was starting off, and during that process creativity developed in creating something new. I can see something in the same way with these babies, that intentionality for doing something doesn't start from the baby, but is by exploring the world and taking part in all sorts of activities. Sort of intentionality emerges from the interaction between the baby's action capabilities and the surrounding objects.
Yeah.
And
so it's not a separate entity like creativity or intentionality sitting by itself, isolated in the brain, and which needs to be added on to the baby's action repertoire. But yeah, I agree. It's an emergent property.
It's an emerging thing and in that prospective control, because things are happening, and you can therefore learn to prospectively adjust to the demands of the environment, so to speak.
It is like your daughter play in the... She's moving around simultaneously.
Just randomly, suddenly
the mobile and oops.
And then it start moving, and then you have to start prospectively trying to hit it again or catch it, whatever. So it's not the intention from the baby that is doing that, but it's sort of evolving in that dynamic relationship.
Nice. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Audrey. Thank you very much, Ruth.
Okay.
Bom, nós filmamos tudo isso, então depois vocês vão ter a possibilidade de ver também, né? avisem para os seus colegas. E pediram para avisar que todo mundo que preencheu a lista vai receber um certificado por e-mail. Ok? E uma salva de palmas para... We have a certificate.
Ah, I love certificates. Thank you. Can I have one?
Yeah.